Please be seated. So, going back to Luke chapter 10. So, we're going to be here for some weeks up to Easter, and I kind of want to walk this path all the way till Easter. Kind of revisiting Luke chapter 10 and this instruction that Jesus gave for reaching the world while he was on his way to give his life for the world. So, we began to look at this passage last week, and I told you there was going to be some elements that we would need to explore, and there's several in here, and that's what we're going to go about doing. So let's look at Luke 10 again, chapter 9. He had just talked about the cost of being a disciple, and it said, after this, the Lord appointed 72 others. Some of your Bibles say 70. Maybe I'll explain that in a minute. And sent them on ahead of him, 2 by 2, into every town and place where he himself was about to go. And he said to them, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into the harvest. This is the point in Luke 10 where most of us stop. Right? Praying for laborers for the harvest. That God would send some laborers for the harvest. This is where most people stop. But we're going to keep going. So verse 3 and 4 I want to talk about today. Go your way, behold, I'm sending you out as lambs in the midst of wolves. Carry no money bag, no knapsack, no sandals, and greet no one on the road. So as we begin to explore this passage, just a few things just for your own knowledge and interest, but some things that I've always drawn from this passage that are very interesting. So some things that Luke says here kind of explain to us why Luke placed this passage in the middle of this journey to Jerusalem. So why 70 or why 72? It's very interesting. So in Jewish, or you would have to say almost Hebrew tradition, because they weren't Jews yet, or weren't called Jews yet at this time. In Jewish tradition, it's 70 elders who were commissioned to translate the law and the prophets from Hebrew into Greek. It became known as the Septuagint. That's where we get our most of our understanding of the Old Testament. In Luke's hands, him using this 70, so if you go back to Genesis 10, there was 70 different peoples in the world that had gone out into the world, so that were in the world at that time. So there's 70 people groups in the world. And so 70, 72, it's a big number in this Jewish tradition. So the 70 or 72 people groups in the world, I think what Luke's doing here is his allusion to sending disciples out to reach every group of people in the world. Okay? In other Jewish texts, such as Genesis 10, the number of nations is 70, and I think that's what Luke's alluding to here. Is it's an ambassador or a disciple to go out to every people group in the world. So I say that because the setting of the 70 is a anticipation of the mission of the gospel to the whole world in the book of Acts. So the book of Acts, the book of Luke are one book. Okay? It's one writing. We split it. We made it 2 books of the Bible. So I believe what Luke is doing here with the sending of the 70 and explaining is this is what it's going to look like when we send out people to every nation in the world. Okay? So there's some kind of background. So his instructions on how this is going to happen. He says, go, and I'm sending you out like sheep among wolves. Most of us have not experienced wolves. Some have, Although I'm reading more and more about the coyotes that are coming into Dallas and attacking people and pets and things. So maybe we are getting some experience. But wolves killed sheep, right? I mean, a wolf saw in a sheep what we might see in a Whataburger, okay? Lunch, okay? So I'm sending you out as sheep among wolves, right? Okay, you get the picture here. That's a tough situation. I'm sending you out like a Whataburger, in front of a hungry wolf. Anyway, so he says, but don't take your bags, don't take your sandals, don't even stop to greet anyone on the road, okay? So they were not to take a lot of baggage on the road with them as they went. In essence, what he's saying here is don't depend on your own resources. I'm sending you out, but don't depend on your own resources. So in the context of the setting of the first century, which is when this was, these disciples or these messengers were sent on their way as strangers who would be dependent on the hospitality of those that they went to. Okay? And so Luke is suggesting, and I wrote this on the back of your bulletin, Luke is suggesting that the mission of God moves forward in the world when disciples of Jesus choose to become like strangers in their communities so that they will be dependent on their host. Okay? As opposed to dominating their community. Now think about that. Luke is suggesting that the mission of God moves forward and gets traction when those who are the messengers of God go into the community and are like strangers in the community, dependent on the community, as opposed to going into community and saying, let's dominate this community. Okay? Let these things kind of resonate. So the story of the sending of the 70 not only illustrates the mission of God to the world, but also how that mission should be carried out. I wish it just said that in the subheading, the sending of the 72, the sending, how God's mission will be carried out would be a better subheading here. And so I think it's radically different than the conception of mission in our time. Not so different than what we do when we go in the mission field, but different from the way we look at our mission here in our community, our cities, our towns, our state, our nation. And so, I've told you this before, I've used this. This comes up in the Bible all the time. This understanding in the ancient Middle East and in the Middle East today of the value of the stranger, okay? The foreigner who was in your country. We don't get that in the United States at all. We don't. Just turn on the TV and you'll see Greg's right. We don't get the value of the stranger, the coming into our culture, the outsider. So there were laws in ancient time that said, if a stranger comes into your town, you must take care of them. And it was cultural, but it was also the law. And so, when a stranger came into a community, you were responsible for their survival. That meant food, clothing, place to sleep, all those sort of things. And so, why did they do this? Well, I think a lot of it is because a couple years down the line, you might be the stranger in somebody else's town, right? And you're hoping that when you go, people are going to treat you as you treated people in your town. So there was, in Jesus' time, in the Middle East, and still today, this deep sympathy in relationship with strangers. So it's really important to understand what lies behind this suggestion that I'm making, that God's intention of the way His mission would look. Because it appears, and you tell me, it appears in this passage that there's a connection, there's a link between being a person who is in need and being able to discern God's mission in the world. You see what I'm saying? There's a link between being that person who allows themselves to become the stranger, to be dependent on their host, and the ability to know, to discern what God's mission is to those same people that we're trying to reach. It's suggesting to me that accepting this and becoming this person who is in the place of a stranger is kind of a forerunner to knowing God's mission. Okay? Just a quick example I like to use of this is Elijah. Elijah prophesied against Jezebel, you remember? And he had to get out of town. And so he gets out of town, and he ends up in a place where ravens have to feed him. Do you remember this story? It's in 1 Kings. And so there's no water there, so he has to go into the town. And this town is where Jezebel's own people are from, and it's full of nothing but Baal worshippers. This is Elijah, prophet of God, going into a town of everybody's a Baal worshipper. Okay? I don't even know of a U.S. city that compares, that I could use as an example. But he goes there, and a widow takes care of him. Right? He's dependent on this widow in this town of Baal worshippers to take care of him. So Elijah, with nothing, having nothing, dwells in the house of this widow, and in the context of living in her home, discovers what God's plan is. So this is a good example of what I'm talking about. He's run out of town. He has nothing. He's living as a stranger among a bunch of pagan sinners. And in that context, he finally realizes, I get what God's mission is. And so he discovers anew and this is the way it happens sometimes for us. We discover as though it was brand new, the mission of God. So Elijah then, I believe, had to go dwell in the house of this widow before he could figure out what was God's mission. And as an outsider, he had nothing to give her. He brought nothing into the situation. And so that's kind of boundary breaking to me. I mean, that kind of breaks the boundaries, but I think this is what happens when the Holy Spirit comes into things. Boundaries get broken. And so this is what Luke is doing. This is the way Luke is framing Jesus' sending of the 70. And the fascinating characteristic of Elijah's story finds itself here in this same passage that Luke is sharing. And so, finding himself as a stranger in a community, the world of Israel gone, taken from him. So Elijah had an understanding of God, for sure, right? We know he did. Powerful prophet of God. He had in his mind exactly what he thought God was doing in the world. And he was in Israel. He was in God's place. He was a prophet to the king. And then in comes Jezebel, but that's another story. But he, all of a sudden, he's cast out. He has to run away. And he finds himself in a place that he's a stranger, in a new and a dangerous place. And Elijah is forced to ask difficult questions about God. Don't you think Elijah said, well, we know he asked God, what are you thinking, God? What are you doing? And don't you think he was wondering about the relationship between God and Israel? Go back and read 1 Kings in the time of Ahab and Jezebel, and it wasn't a good time for the people of Israel. And so this was also the situation of the Christians among whom Luke was writing to. Okay? Christian people living among pagan Roman people. Okay? Worshipping all kinds of gods and doing all kinds of ungodly things. So the parallel can kind of be made this way. Elijah's world was turned upside down, and he was confused about God and his relationship to his people. And it challenged the assumptions that Elijah had about God and how he was going to do things. Okay? And so this happened to the communities that Luke was writing to. Okay? Powerful things were happening in the Christian movement. Okay? But there was still this confusion about how God was going to work among all of these pagan Roman people. And so Elijah found answers to his confusion when he was forced outside. Okay, when he was pushed outside in his established world, and he was placed in situations where he became dependent on the hospitality of the very people to which he were in great need of his ministry. Okay, and so the question, so a big question comes from this. Is it the case that this boundary-breaking Spirit of God is placing these Christians in the book of Luke in a very similar situation? Okay, those being sent into the world that doesn't know Jesus, are they being put in the same situation? I think so. I think it's exactly so. I think it's exactly what's happening. So as we bridge the context to our time, and our city, our community here, Mockingbird, our city, Dallas, and our workplace, and our schools, all of that, is He, the Spirit of God, doing the same thing with us? Is He turning things upside down here in the United States of America from the way we thought they were going to be and always going to be? Is He putting us into a very similar situation as Elijah, as these 70? You know, the question is, will the church discover answers in the crisis that we find ourselves in? And that's the thing to me in our day. The church is in crisis. I think we wonder about God and His relationship with people here. God, what's going on? And so the church has kind of a crisis of identity right now. And so will we do like the 70? Will we do like Elijah and allow ourselves to be put into an experience of becoming the strangers here in our own land? Will we be willing to do that and become strangers? And we'll cut loose some of the baggage that we carry and then enter into our towns and our communities and receive hospitality from others? In the next few years, I think we'll see. I think we'll see. You know, Brian and Michael, come here. I want to do a little experiment here. So, Brian and Michael, you're being sent out as a disciple. Okay, so let's say this is the starting line. So you're both going to stand here, and you're both going to go reach the world. And so the community you're supposed to reach is the blue chairs. So all you got to do is get back to here, and you will have reached the community. Okay, so line up, and just and see who gets back first. Okay, on your mark. Wait. I forgot. Y'all going to need a Bible. Okay, you got a Bible. Okay, you ready? On your mark. Wait a minute. I don't have the exact thing, but Michael, you're going to need a sound system. If you're going to reach people, you're going to need a sound system and microphones and speakers. Okay, so you're going to do it right, so you're going to need that. Okay, are you ready? On your mark. Wait. You're going to need some literature and some cases of Bibles. You're never going to be able to reach people if you don't have some tracts and some Bibles and some literature. Okay? Go ahead, Mike. Get ready. On your mark. Oh, wait. What are you going to feed them? You got to have a coffee bar. You got to have a coffee bar and some food to feed them. Okay. I think you can flip that up over you. Okay, that's all I'm going to do to you. No more. So can you pick that up? Okay, let's see who can get back first. Got to spread the gospel message in this community. You ready? On your mark, get set, go. Come on. All right. So, good job. And you didn't even have any tents or anything like that. I could have loaded you down with a whole lot more baggage. Thank you guys. Thank you guys. But you see where I'm going. You see where I'm going with that. When we send people out, we send them with a lot of baggage, right? We don't think we can share the gospel unless we have all of these things. But what Luke is saying and what God showed Elijah is, and you know what? I started not to use the Bible, but I felt like Brian needed to carry something in the thing. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Michael. Brian had everything he needed to spread the gospel. And he didn't even need the Bible. You know why? Because he has enough right here to spread the mission of God. I mean, this is just kind of a funny example, but this is exactly what these two verses are showing us. So leaving baggage behind is the key to what Luke is saying. So it's a radical reorientation for the people in this time and for us today. When I talk about it, people think I'm crazy. How are we going to do ministry without all of these things? Right? I mean, if you want to see an example, you just look at people who are going to have what we kind of call, a rally or something, or a crusade, and there's diesel truck after diesel truck after diesel truck coming in. Okay? And so, this is unfamiliar and far from the ideas of what the church needs to send people into the communities that we live in. So, let me give you a couple more examples, and then I'll keep moving. Take the way we evangelize today. Okay? Our current ways of evangelizing calls for many different ways of evangelizing people. Okay? And so we usually develop different categories of the people who we're going to reach. And we come up with these categories, and then we put the people in our communities, our cities, and our state into these categories, and then we decide how we're going to go out and we reach them. And so what do we come up with when we decide who we're going to reach? We've got to have a program. We've got to develop a program. So there's a program for reaching children. There's a program for reaching street people. There's a program for reaching, maybe men. A program for reaching women. But we've got all these programs that we're designing, and then we've got to have all of the things that we need to reach these different kinds of people. And so what do we need then? We need an event. We got a program now. We got to have an event so we can reach these people. And we think, and of course they're outsiders. They're not part of us. So we call them what? They. The mission field there is a word you got to use. There's us and there's they. I kept trying to find the they because everybody kept talking about them and they, and I was like, who are they? Who's the they? Well, that's everybody who's not part of the us. Well, you got to lose that, and so we asked the question though. Here's where you hear the they. I wonder if they would be interested in attending our event or our program. And then the question for the people trying to design the program is, Well, what do we need so they will come? And that's some of the things that I was loading Michael down with. So the things he had to carry with him was the things that they might want or they might need, right? And so we come up with these things, and then we go out and we institute our program or our event. And what I see is we send our people out fully loaded down. The other time I used this example, I had a rope, and Michael, you would have been better off. I had a rope where you could tie it all together. So I didn't have a rope for you today. It would have been easier if you could have tied that up. Then you'd have been able to pick it up. I never really intended for you to get 10 feet. So you got a lot further than I meant to load you down where you wouldn't make it very far. But that's what we do. We load up people with so much stuff, they don't get very far. Okay? And so the church, we want our people fully armed. We want them to have all the research. We want them to have all the different methods for assessing somebody's readiness for receiving the gospel. And so we have the nicest programs to offer. In other words, churches send out people with lots of pre-packaged baggage. Okay, I know I'm belaboring this. I need to keep going. So, when we send people out with baggage, here's why it's not good. We lose two things. So when we send people out with tons of baggage, we lose two things. We lose the ability to see people and their needs as they really are, and an openness to see what God is doing. See that? An ability to see people and their needs where they really are, and an openness to see what God's doing. So first, we label people. We decide before we go to them what they need, right? I see it all the time. We go out and tell people, this is what we're going to bring to you. This is what we're going to do for you. We put you in a category. We know exactly what you need. Okay? And so it's not like we go into them as the other who needs to dwell among them to see, where they are and what they need and be present in their life. And so what do we do when we do that? When we just go out and we're among them looking at their needs, then we're able to be present with them, to be present in their lives, to be with them as other human beings present in their lives. And so what do? We turn them into an object of our plans. Okay? And so I think this is the worst kind of baggage the church has today. We turn people into objects. Just look at a big churches' ministries and look at the names of the things they do in outreach, and they've made objects out of a lot of different kinds of people. Okay? That's the first one. Second, when we go out with our baggage and our plan, we've already decided what God's doing. Right? We're telling God what we're going to go out and do for you and what we need to do it. And so we've already determined what God's up to. So I think God looks at that and says, what do you need me for? What do you need me for? In the boundary-breaking era of the Spirit, I believe this is precisely why we need a different approach. Okay? We cannot ask the question of what God is up to in our neighborhoods and communities if we've already decided what that is. Hear that. And so it seems to me that Luke is trying to tell us something that is of critical importance when he says to not take anything with you, to leave your baggage at home. And if you think he's talking about suitcases, you're really missing the point here. If you think he's literally talking about not taking a purse, I think there is a literal point here, but if you're missing the point here. It seems Luke is trying to tell us something. that in the time of the boundary breaking spirit, when established assumptions like with Elijah and like the time of Jesus and like the time we live in, that we need a radically different road. Okay? We must leave our baggage behind and be willing to become like the stranger, and then in need of welcoming, in need of care of the other. I think it's the only way that we're going to figure out what God is doing, if we have any chance of figuring out what God is doing. The thing is, though, and it's hard, I fall into it all the time. I follow into it all the time, and I'm always willing to let somebody try something. I don't usually say no. Read my message or go back and look at my sermon where I talked about baggage. Everybody who wants to try something, I usually let them try something. Right? Somebody tells me this is what we need, or this is what we should do, or we should get all this and go do this. I say, okay, I've done it like 100 times, but let's try again. Maybe this will be the one time God is going to use it. But I fall into it myself sometimes, loading up with the baggage. Okay, I could give you some examples recently, but I'll just say that. But what I find is that most churches, because of the direction things are heading, they're searching frantically, and they're trying to decide among themselves, what can we do? What can we do to make people, in the most friendly way, it's got to be friendly too, in the most friendly way to get people to come and be attracted to us. And so they come up with all kinds of things, all kinds of baggage, all kinds of things that they can offer, right, and do. And so we come up with our plans, and we come up with what we want to achieve. And that's what is the most important thing in most ministries. What is our plan, and what do we want to achieve? And people keep looking at and re-talking about it. Those are two huge pieces of baggage. Our plans and what we want to do are two huge pieces of baggage. And I think they're two huge pieces of baggage from that keep us from asking two questions. What are God's plans, and what does God want to do? I should put that right there somewhere. What is God's plan, and what does God want to do? Because that should be what we talk about most. Okay? And Luke is pointing in a different direction. Then, if I'm wrong on this, if you think I'm wrong, just mark out chapter 10, the first 12 verses. There's no other passage like this in the New Testament. It's unique to Luke. And it's right smack in the middle of what it means to be a follower and woe to the unrepentant sentences. People say, why is that there? It's a mystery. It's a mystery why these 12 verses are here. And I'm fairly certain I'm right about why they're here. Because Luke wanted to advise us in the context of Jesus going to Jerusalem, where he would die. He wanted it in that context, in that setting. And so Luke is pointing the church in a very different direction than it's been heading for some time. And so what this does, it's like a roadmap. This is a really neat passage, and we're going to cover it in the next few weeks. You can actually map out a ministry based on this passage. You can sit down on it with a big whiteboard, and you can map out a ministry. The thoughts and imaginations of the past. That's what I talked about last week when I talked about dwelling in this passage, giving ourselves a new imagination, a godly imagination, letting God have our imagination. But the things of the past are not going to support the ministry when the Spirit of God breaks through. When the Spirit of God breaks through, all these things, you know what? I'm of this belief, though. It's going to happen. The Spirit of God is going to continue to move in this United States. People are going to continue to come to know Jesus in this United States. And when the Spirit of God moves, that's the time to get moving with Him. But if we're unwilling to ask, what is God doing, and what is God's plan, and what is God doing, then we might miss it. Okay, so when the Spirit of God breaks through, the people of God then ask, what is God doing? Okay? And I really believe that's what's happening in our time. And I believe we're in a time like Elijah. We're surrounded by a bunch of Baal worshipers, right? You can't help but see that. It's not as bad in Dallas as some other parts of the United States, but there's a lot of Baal worshipers, if you get what I mean. And I believe Luke is trying to help us understand that. And I believe our church, we need to release the baggage. And it's not just our church, it's the church. We need to release the baggage. It's freeing too. It's freeing. See, I only asked Brian to run around once with nothing and Michael once. But if we had them do that all day, I tell you what, if all of a sudden Michael was told, all you got to carry is a Bible and you got everything you need, he'd be like, whoop, yes. So that's what I'm telling you. All we need is the Word of God. All we need is what's right here in our heart to save our city, to save our community. We don't need anything else. But I can hear all my buddies in the ministry. But Pastor, they won't come. They won't come without all the stuff. Friends, if they're coming for the stuff, they're coming for the wrong reason. And I love comfortable chairs and good coffee. I love good coffee. I'm glad we have air and heat. There's some basic things. But we want them to come to find Jesus. And so, I think Luke is trying to point the church in a direction. He's trying to give us a map. It's a blueprint for the road ahead, not just for our church, but for the church in America. Things are going to change dramatically for the church in America in the next 10 years. Dramatically. And so I think what he wants is an old way of thinking, an old way of imagining, which is really, if you'll take the time to study it, I told you last week, if the church before about halfway through the 19th century were to see the church of the next 150 years, they'd go, where'd that church come from? They wouldn't recognize it. We built a very different kind of church. Churches of different times are very different. We reimagine God's mission. We reimagine the ways of reaching people. And it's time in 2019. In fact, it's 20 years too late. But I think some people are doing it. It's time for the church in the United States of America to reimagine what God is doing among her people. It's time. I think the Spirit of God is working in the Mockingbird community. I know He is, because the Bible says He is. I know He is. And so we need to get out with our neighborhood. We need to get out into our community with an understanding of what it means to be God's people in the world today. I would just challenge you. Go back to read about Elijah, 1 Kings 17, and don't look at it as some Old Testament story, but as the example I was talking about. I mean, I think people talk about Elijah being fed by ravens and then being no water, then going to this widow, and it's just some old Bible story, but it's not. it's a glimpse into what it looks like to be a prophet, a follower of God. I'll stop there. Bunch of new illustrations just popped in here. And you're going, oh no, that's trouble. That's trouble. So we're going to continue through this passage, walking up. So just a challenge for you this week, as you think about ministering to other people. Think about the baggage you bring into that. All you need is here, but I encourage you to take this too. That the more time you spend in this, the more this will be in here. Okay? Pray with me. Father, thank you for this passage. Thank you for this time. I pray that the example of leaving our baggage behind will help us and will enforce within us an understanding that we have everything we need to share our Lord. Everything, Father, it's in our heart because you're there. The Holy Spirit dwells in us. The same Spirit that's working among the people we know lives in us. Father, just help us, our minds, our imaginations, to put all that together. Help us to forget about all of that which is written about church growth and just listen to your Spirit. Give us a courage, give us an audacity when it comes to you, to trust and knowing that, like someone who left to go into a foreign land but didn't take any money and didn't take any clothes and didn't have any means or mechanism for getting food, that the strangers there are going to care for them. Help us to know that that picture is the way you're going to care for us. And I pray this in the name of Jesus. Amen. We're going to take our offering and sing.